Actually, I wanted to steal this opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about the kind of writing on a higher level that I'm trying to do. Because, in fact, it's interesting, you know, one of the things that I've had to do, that I'm doing for promotion, is you end up writing blog posts. You go on sort of blog tours now. And it's funny because I normally don't like to write nonfiction. I tend to prefer to put all my thoughts and all my feelings and let them kind of get processed unconsciously and just come out in fiction. But when you start to try to write about your process, about what you're doing, about writing in general, sometimes you kind of have to nail down some of your thinking, and I found that I've been doing that. And I sort of want to talk about it a little bit because I think there's something, I do think that there's a kind of movement happening right now where for a long time, really, there's been a certain kind of model of authorship. A kind of top-down model, basically. The relationship kind of between the creator and the audience. And that has been changing drastically, you know, just because it's become much easier to be a creator. The tools of creation in various kinds of media have become more accessible. And the ability to talk back to creators has been changing because of social media networks and the accessibility, the way that basically makes it much easier to have relationships between one and many. So what I wanted to talk about is how that kind of can change what it is that you're trying to accomplish as a creator, how that different relationship with your audience changes what you're doing, and how that can come out differently in your fiction. You know, obviously there was for a long time, the process of creation was you sit in a room, you make something, especially as an author, you really do sit alone in a room, and even now that's true. And you make something and you put it out to an audience who, if they talk back about it, they generally are sort of talk amongst themselves. You don't necessarily hear it back. You might get a letter from a fan every once in a while. If it's even bigger, if it's something like you're making a movie, your audience essentially has almost no way to respond to you except by, you know, how many ticket sales there are on the opening weekend or whatever. And so these boundaries are getting broken a lot right now, and this happens obviously in software as well. In my previous life, I was a programmer and still do it for fun now, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But basically, you know, all those feature requests and feedback and bug reports, and the problem is that it's very hard to respond to all of that. Trying to form a relationship on the basis of replying to every sort of individual comment is very hard, and people generally don't like to do it, especially people who are creating things. You don't want to interrupt the flow of being able to either write something or coding something. I'm sure everybody here has been in lots of meetings and doesn't like the way that they break up the workday. And basically, so I sort of want, and that doesn't necessarily align with the creator's goals. Creators obviously have various different goals, but I sort of would simplify them to say that creators want to either make art or software, or make a product, do good work. That's one sort of intrinsic goal. They like to get praised, and they like to get paid. So those are some very, very obvious, very basic things. But I'm interested what happens when you kind of change some of those goals, sometimes subtly, and when you get past that kind of limited relationship, even a relationship where the audience is talking back to the creator, to a different kind of relationship that's not necessarily visible in a lot of mainstream media. So about me first, where this all comes from. So I've been writing full-time since 2004. But my background, actually, to sort of go back even further, when I went to college, I was an English major, and I was going to be a journalist. Specifically, I was going to be Lois Lane. And sadly, I did an internship and did a lot of newspaper writing and discovered that Superman comics are not necessarily the most accurate depiction of a journalistic career. And after that, I did actually squeak out of college with my English degree, but in fact, what I spent my senior year doing was mushing. I don't know, has anybody here heard of mushes? Yes, I see a few. So mush stands for multi-user shared hallucination. And anybody who's played, either tabletop role-playing games like D&D, or has played an infocom game or a text adventure game, you are in a maze of twisty little passages all alike kind of thing. You've had that experience, except mushes are built, generally, they're text-only games. They are built by the participants, who then use them as a setting for role-playing games. And I actually learned to code in the internal programming language of mushes, which was called mush code. And that is, in fact, descriptive of the way the code looks. And basically, since then, I've sort of oscillated between programming and writing. I decided this was great. I wanted to work on computer games. So with an English degree, it's kind of hard to get a job working on computer games. So I was working and working at the same time on a graduate degree in computer science. And while I was doing that, I was also writing as a hobby. I was writing fan fiction. I started doing that basically in 1995. I discovered, this was actually even before, 1994, so this was before Mosaic, before the first web browser. I discovered the VAX VMS system at Brown and got on the Star Trek L mailing list. Yes, I see a few people, yay. And I started writing next generation fan fiction. Because there were other people doing that, and I thought this was great. This was just this wonderful experience, and nobody was getting paid for it, because for anybody who doesn't know what fan fiction is, it's basically you take typically a TV series or a movie or a book, and you write stories about the characters and settings set in that universe, and you're generally doing it non-commercially. You're not doing it to try and sell it. People obviously do write those kinds of stories commercially as tie-in novels, but that's actually tends to be quite far away from what fan fiction is. And people write these stories just for love and post them and share them with one another. And it becomes part of building a community, basically, around this kind of work. So anyway, while I was working on my computer science degree professionally, I was writing fan fiction as a hobby, and then I actually had the chance to work on a computer game. I got a chance to work on Neverwinter Nights' expansion set, Shadows of Untitled. And I discovered that working in crunch mode for 6 months at a time was also not quite as much fun as it might have sounded. And basically, I came out of that process. I had the exciting opportunity on that game. When you have a really small team working on something, you get to be a little more jack of all trades. So I actually had come onto the expansion set team as a programmer, but they also needed help with the design. So I actually got to do designing/programming, and I got to participate in the process of designing an entire computer game, 30 hours of gameplay, and the work of structuring that, and then figuring out how all the sort of side plots and how you were going to let I say readers, but of course it's players, how you were going to let players have meaningful impacts on the universe, despite the fact that in some ways you have to kind of bring it back to key points so that the limited number of cinematics in the budget can all make sense, no matter whether you're playing like the evil player who's out to conquer the entire universe, or the noble paladin who's there to save everybody and be a good guy. And I came out of that process and realized, all right, so I don't actually want to move to Edmonton and work 100 hours a week for the rest of my life. What am I going to do now? And a good friend of mine said, why don't you try writing a novel? And I did, and it was terrible. It was like 20,000 words, and I junked it after struggling to make it work. And then about a couple months later, I saw the movie Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, which is based on the Aubrey Maturin books by Patrick O'Brien. And shortly afterwards, I came out of that, that was awesome. What could make it better? Dragons. So that was basically the start of the Temeraire series. It's like, how could I make the Age of Sail even more awesome? And clearly it's, throw some dragons in there. The thing is, of course, that is actually very much a kind of fan fiction move. It is an impulse. Fan fiction is the impulse to want more, but a little different. More, but from this perspective. More of this, but I want these characters to have a relationship. More, but I want to see inside that character's head who's actually the bad guy. And that kind of impulse through fan fiction also lends itself to more of that, but with dragons. More of that, but how about if they were in space? And that kind of play is really quite key to the sort of fanfic kind of aesthetic, I would say. So that was in 2004 that I started writing the Temeraire series. And in 2007, because I got bored, I started a nonprofit organization called the Organization for Transformative Works. And this was born out of some frustration in that a lot of us in the fan fiction and sort of the broader fan works community saw, there was a company specifically then called FanLib that basically was trying to create a fan fiction archive that they were going to monetize, and they were inviting fan fiction writers to come and post on their site, and they were saying things like, we'll put you in touch with the creators, we'll run contests, and here, by the way, agree to these terms of service where you indemnify us in case you ever get sued for copyright and infringement, and that'll be your problem, not ours. And so many of us were quite up in arms about this, and I made the mistake of writing a long post about how we needed an archive of our own, how we needed a home for fan fiction and fan works that was like fan fiction itself, done in a non-commercial way that basically supported preserving fan works for the long term, which is another major issue. When you have non-commercial things, there's nobody kind of paying to keep the lights on. And so a lot of times fan fiction, literally just enormous swaths of it just vanished into thin air. Obviously, I'm sure many people here remember the days of GeoCities. Well, a lot of people hosted their fan fiction on GeoCities, and a lot of those people, after they posted their stories, they left their sites up, but they went away. And when GeoCities went down, it just was gone, just disappeared. A lot of that work, because a lot of them had, carefully made sure their work was not indexable, not archivable by, the archive.org. Crawlers, they were anxious about their work being taken down, and they didn't necessarily value their work. They didn't necessarily value their work because, of course, there was no price tag on it, and yet those stories are extremely valuable to people within the community. So among that, we basically, within this community, we decided to build ourselves an archive. The archive of our own went into beta in 2008. It now has 1.5 million works on it, more than 500,000 users. We get 90 million page views a week from about more than 8 million unique visitors. And this was done with literally no advertising. There is no paid staff whatsoever. There have been a total, over the entire lifetime of the project, of 3 volunteer professional systems administrators, usually one at a time. There have been, I think, a total of 4 professional coders, if you count me as a professional coder, which I actually was not during this time period. Everyone else, basically, who has worked on this project was an amateur. Some people who worked on it literally had never written a line of code before. Most of the people who are our QA team are complete newbies when they come in. The support staff is basically just all volunteers, and they respond to literally every support inquiry, to every question that they get. And this whole team is 95% female. It is, as far as I know, the largest open source project, female-run open source project. And it is not just an open source piece of software, it's an actual site that's being maintained under so many people. And basically, I'm talking about these various pieces of my experience because they all come out of the kind of creator-audience relationship that I want to sort of discuss, a different kind of creator-audience relationship. And the things that come out of, the changes that come out of that relationship, I find apply both to my writing, both to the, and to the software that I've worked on, and not just that I've worked on, but there have always been fan fiction writers who go pro. That process is accelerating, especially now with self-publishing becoming much easier. One of the barriers to entering publishing for a lot of writers was the sort of not wanting to go through the process of rejection, not wanting to go through the process of gatekeeping. And now a lot of people, and not having the sort of the time to write an entire kind of novel on spec. And a lot of people are now sort of moving to writing professionally, to writing original fiction, who were only previously writing fan fiction, but are bringing that kind of aesthetic with them. So I kind of wanted to talk about it because I think it's interesting. And also, I mean, quite frankly, I do feel a bit activist about this, in that I would love to see more of the fiction that I read and more of the software that I use, and more of the media that I consume generally kind of come from this place that I'm going to talk about. So specifically, I talked about how fan fiction, you can't sell it. And so it creates a gift economy where, those 3 goals that I talked about for creators, making good art, getting praised, getting paid, where the getting paid part apparently disappears. Except it does not actually disappear. People are getting paid, but they're getting paid in barter. So in fan fiction, the reason you would write a fanfic story is because you want that more. You want more but different. And so the problem is that if you want more, you can't generally write fast enough to satisfy yourself. And so what you really want is you want other people to write stories for you in exchange for the story that you wrote for them. And that actually kind of creates a different kind of relationship and a different kind of incentive for writers. Sometimes this actually becomes, this sort of exchange becomes explicit, where I run a challenge called I used to run actually, I finally retired last year, very happily, a challenge called the Yuletide Challenge, which basically every holiday season, about 2,000 people sign up, and they get randomly assigned. They sign up for something between, they say, I'll write a story in any one of these 6 fandoms, and I want a story in any one of these 4 fandoms. And we match them up, And basically, each person gets kind of assigned as a secret Santa for somebody else. So you're writing a story for someone who you may not even know, and that person is writing a story for someone else that they may not even know, and meanwhile, someone's writing a story for you. And this giant sort of exchange happens where everybody is writing these stories, and these are, Yuletide is specifically for rare and obscure fandoms. So it's the fandoms where you never get to see a story in your tiny little fandom. And I'm trying to think what the and you also just, people can submit, like, can ask for sort of the most obscure, most bizarre things. I've seen, there was a great story a few years ago that was basically texts from cephalopods. I don't know if any of you have seen this. It is basically a story about an octopus and a squid sending each other iPhone text messages. And somebody wanted that for Yuletide because they had seen like a video of an octopus. I think it was that Nopetopus. Do any of you know the one I'm talking about? It's like the octopus that's running across the screen and it's going nope, 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 nope. So basically, this kind of exchange can happen explicitly in that model, but it also is happening informally all the time. In that the goals for, people basically want more of those stories. I just the other week, I literally watched someone read through. I have 13 Captain America fanfic stories posted. A total of about 80,000 words. And literally within the space of like 4 hours, I got 13 comments because this person was reading each story, leaving a comment very nicely, going to the next story, reading it, and just that kind of binge, it's Netflix watching, it's binge watching, except, with fanfic, and you get through it too quickly, and you want more. And how do you get more? You get more by basically building a community around your fandom. You get more by building a community not just around your fandom, but about the specific characters or the specific pairing. People do a lot of shipping in fandom. You get people to write you stories that are not just, you don't just want people to write you stories in a particular fandom necessarily, you want them to write the kind of stories you want. And so you want, so obviously this changes the relationship between the creator and the audience in some interesting ways. First of all, it changes status, right? So we're all kind of little hierarchical animals. And normally, there's that kind of geek hierarchy where, if you're the science fiction writer, you're like on the higher level of the hierarchy. But in fandom, in fanfic, that doesn't happen. Because you are writing for people that you're hoping are going to write you something back. So you are kind of writing to your peers. You're writing to people who are in it with you. You are trying to court them. You're specifically trying to invoke their own creativity. You really want to inspire people to write more. You really want them to sort of feel like you want them to maybe not write more. You would love somebody. There's nothing that fanfic writers love more than when somebody makes a piece of fan art for their story. And fan art artists love it when writers then take their artwork and write a story based on it. And that kind of free interplay is something that people are constantly trying to generate. You also want people to be encouraged to leave comments, to talk, because those comments, the more commenting is going on in a fandom, the more likely it is that somebody else is going to want to jump in and write their own stories because they know they're going to get a lot of feedback. And often, there's one other piece, which is that often you're trying to convince the audience of your take. So I don't know how many of you have ever heard of like the massive, massive flame wars that went on in Harry Potter fandom between like Harry, Ginny, Harry, Hermione. There were, people literally wanted to kill each other over this stuff. And you think, like, why do you care? Why are you having these incredible battles over this stuff? And of course, it's because there is actually a finite resource being competed for to some extent. You are literally trying to get the good writers, you want the good writers, you want all the writers to kind of come to your side of the force. You want them to come and play with you and write the stories that you really want. And how dare they go and write that other pairing? And people really feel that, and even the rational among us, who recognize that that the heart wants what it wants, and you can't make people love something, and you have to just sort of enjoy everything that's being created. Even you still feel that sort of like when a fanfic writer that you love starts writing in a pairing that isn't your pairing, you always feel that moment where you're like, I wish they had written the story for me. And so, and actually, interestingly, one of the things that people frequently criticize fanfiction for is the quality. People are like, fanfiction is terrible. People have stopped saying that so much, at least to me, possibly because I talk about fanfiction a lot, so they're scared to say it to me now. But people would often talk about the problems with fanfiction, and I mean, as I think we have seen, thanks to Kindle Direct Publishing, it's not about fanfiction; it's about the lack of gatekeeping. Sturgeon's law acts very powerfully, but for instance, I have seen a lot of people talk about, for instance, 50 Shades of Grey, which started life as fan fiction, about how it's so bad, and they talk about it in this, and I know many people who are just sort of confused they feel like they don't like it. They look at the text, and it's not even that it's not for them. It's just like it seems like it's badly written. But one of the interesting things is that bad fan fiction actually can serve some of the function of some of those goals. Your fan fiction does not necessarily have to be great or even good to help produce a community. In fact, I know many people who are motivated by bad fan fiction. Somebody writes a bad fanfic story and that makes them mad. And they're like, this story, that idea wasn't good, that idea was good, but they did it so badly, I'm gonna write it again. Or they read the story, it's like the characters would never behave that way. It's terrible, I'm gonna write it again. And so, and frankly, just having people talking, it's like the power of having somebody talking in a room, sort of breaking the ice in a way, and kind of making somebody else feel like, well, I could write a story as good as that one, or I could write a story better than that, and so I'm going to try. Actually has some of those community building effects, whether or not the actual work itself is necessarily brilliantly written. But of course, good fan fiction, really well-written fan fiction, is trying to do something, is also trying to accomplish those same goals. It's trying to make the good art, and it's trying to be praised. The fan fiction writers love comments and feedback, since that's the only, that's sort of the immediate direct reward that they get for it. But they are also trying to get, it is trying to be seductive. It is trying really actively to give pleasure, and it's trying to give pleasure of a kind that you want mirrored back to you. Generally, if you write the kinds of stories that you want to read in fandom. And the way that differs from sort of, the kind of more mainstream model, the more common model, is that a lot of times that is only performative. A lot of times, you're writing a book, you want your book to completely stand out. You don't want your book to be like anything that anybody else has written. You want your book, you want people to say, that's an original work of genius. You want people to say, I've never seen anything like that before. You want people to say, you want to have, and frequently you want to have a kind of controlling effect on the reader's experience. That's kind of the model. That's a lot of times, it's sort of that film director thing of, sit in this theater, turn off your cell phones, you're going to experience my vision for the next 2 hours, and you're going to like it. And that's really sort of the antithesis of the fan fiction kind of approach, where you're like, here, look at this thing. Don't you want to come and don't you want to start talking with me about it? Don't you want to make something just like this? And a lot of times you get that in books as well. You get authors are trying to cause the reader to really have an experience that they're trying to push on the reader, and it's not necessarily what they almost think the reader wants. It's like they want to perform, they want to show off, they want to show their skill, they want to convince you that, they want to convince you that they're great writers, they want to convince you that this is a great story. They aren't always necessarily thinking about giving pleasure. They aren't always necessarily thinking about making you really just deeply entertained. And, so specifically like the grimdark genre, which I feel like has been really dominant for a long time now, and we've seen it largely because, so there are kind of cultural influences on this. So, HBO has produced Game of Thrones, Sopranos, a lot of just, and a lot of kind of cable television has this sort of incentive where the way they differentiate themselves from networks is they can have more violence and more sex. And generally what they do is they have a lot more violence, they have a lot of sexual violence, and they have, some more sex, but they still are quite leery of getting categorized as pornographic, so very often the sex is not super fun. So the grimdark genre broadly is kind of like convincing the reader to believe in the universe you've made, and convince them and let them sort of suspend their disbelief by being like, this universe just sucks so horribly. Look at all these terrible things. And sort of putting one unpleasant experience after another to kind of create this feeling that it's not sort of a shiny plastic universe. And we all kind of get a lot of shiny plastic universes from Hollywood, and sort of not super exciting books, and we don't generally want the super plastic. So in grimdark was kind of a reaction to something coming before it, but at the same time, that kind of brutality, that kind of knowing that this universe that you're in as a reader, as a consumer, is terrible, can be kind of deadening. You're kind of scared to like anybody on Game of Thrones. Because you know that the chances are they're really terrible shit's going to happen to them. Sorry, it's hard to care about Batman when you actually accept that Gotham is just totally irredeemable and is going to stay terrible no matter what he does, and that everything is just awful and nobody there deserves to be saved. And then finally, like, why do I care about Batman? Why am I watching this? I was just watching Princess Bride with my child the other day. It's like, why are you reading me this for? And I frequently feel that way sometimes. So what I think of as the fan fiction, or possibly more broadly I should call it the optimistic literary aesthetic, what it's trying to do instead is it's not necessarily trying to tell you a happy story. It's not trying to tell you a plastic story, a sanitized story where everything works out great and nothing ever bad happens and everybody survives and they all live happily ever after, because that's not pleasurable. But it is trying to give you a really deeply pleasurable experience where you feel like the author is kind of in the trenches with you. The author is like, this is an experience that I want to have, and I'd like you to kind of come along with me. And that feeling, when you get that feeling that the author is in the trenches with you in that way, in that sort of intimate way where they're trying to sell you something that they would like to buy themselves, is that it allows you to have a kind of trust. If you believe that an author really kind of is deeply invested in a particular character, or really loves a particular character and feels for that character the same way that they are trying to make you, the reader, care about that character, then you don't know, that doesn't tell you that character is not going to die, but it does tell you that that character is not going to die in an unsatisfying, empty way. If that character dies, it is not going to be for an effect in the larger universe. It's going to be because it is a meaningful part of that character's story. And, as a, and that trust, knowing that, allows you to kind of lower your barriers. This is, especially in fan fiction, a lot of fan fiction readers, there's a lot of trigger warnings in fan fiction that people try to put on their work. People generally, specifically try to alert people for any kind of graphic violence or sexual violence. There's a lot of, fan fiction is very heavily female dominated. There are a lot of victims of sexual assault in it. And there are many people who both either want to avoid it completely or actively want, there's rape fiction is actually a huge genre in fan fiction where, people frequently are working through kind of issues that they have had. And at the same time, it's all kind of labeled so that people go into it knowing what they're getting, and knowing the experience that they're going to have, and that the writer is in it with them and is having the experience with them. And that means that, and that actually this doesn't stop, in fact, this effect of this audience change doesn't stop at just writing. Fan fiction also has basically kind of, in the fan fiction community, the function of editing is taken over by beta readers. And beta readers, in professional publishing, I actually have been very lucky in that I've had multiple long-term relationships with editors. But a lot of editors are essentially in a job for like a year and then they're gone. They move to a different company, they move to a different position, they have different authors, and you don't have an incentive to kind of create a long-term relationship. And very frequently, there's a process that happens where the author's first book comes in, they get lots of attention, they've worked on it for 10 years, it goes out, and it's a big success. And the second one, they just want it on time. They just want it on deadline, they want it to schedule, they don't, and a very little editing gets done on sort of the second book, the third book. In fact, all of my work gets edited by my fan fiction beta readers before my editor sees it. And my fan fiction beta readers are a lot tougher than my editor. And my editor is very good, but my fangirls are like brutal. And that's partly because, again, just like with the writing, beta readers in fanfic are starting from the same place. They're actually peers with the author. It's not a kind of, subordinate relationship. They are peers because they are invested. They are both starting from the same place of being invested in the fandom, of being invested in the characters and the universe that they're working from, and feeling equally authoritative. If you're beta reading a fan fiction story, you can say, well, no, Captain Kirk would not do that. And you have as much right to say that as the author of the story does. Obviously, when you're doing it with original work, it's harder. First of all, it's harder to get your beta readers, to get an editor invested in an original world the same way that somebody is invested in an original world, in the world of a show or television or movie, whatever, that they already love themselves independently. But it can be done, and when you get somebody who is willing to kind of invest that way in your original work, who will tell you if it sucks, who will tell you that they think the characters that you invented are acting in an out-of-character way in the story you just wrote, that's where you get the best work. That's the kind of editing that produces truly great work. And basically that's something that happens so routinely in fan fiction that you almost take it for granted as a fan fiction writer until you go to like professional publishing and suddenly you're getting such very nice notes from your editor. And they're like, well, maybe you might want to change the scene. And meanwhile, the fan fiction, the beta reader's like, ugh, that scene was terrible. What were you thinking? Destroy it completely, burn it with fire. And, but you get places faster that way. And frankly, this also happens with software. The archive was built, the only incentive that we possibly had to offer people to come and spend enormous amounts of free time writing code for the archive that they could be gainfully paid for somewhere else, was basically that they really wanted an archive so that they wouldn't have their stories getting lost, so that they could actually go back and read the stories. Many of the people who've worked on the archive, are themselves not fan fiction writers, but they read fan fiction. They look at fan art, they watch fan vids, and this was in fact their way of kind of giving back to that community, of participating in the gift economy. So as a result, of course, the archive actually has some features. So for instance, it has a complete set of tools for running the kind of gift exchange challenges that I was talking about, even though that isn't what you would, if you were sitting down if you were doing it as a professional corporate thing and you wrote, what are the 10 biggest features that we need for our archive, that would not appear on the list. That should not have been, in a certain way, part of the core functionality. But in fact, it was extremely important to have it as part of the core functionality because it's what got our coders working. It's what brought people to the table. It's what brought people with their skills to the table. It's also what meant that people who run challenges in fandom are frequently the kinds of people who have large communities and lots of friends. And so they came to the archive because it had much better tools. And then they were like, to all their friends, all their networks, basically like, come over here and let's play over here and put your stories on here. And that's entirely how the whole system built. It also has, for instance, a skin system that essentially allows you to completely, if you know a little CSS, you could essentially completely redesign the entire front end of the archive to your tastes. And one of the example skins was like pink and had pandas on it. And these are sort of cases of like things that don't necessarily make sense, but they were passionate. They had real there was investment visible in their presence on the archive. And that, in fact, in turn, changes the relationship that the users have with the archive, in that people who are using the archive can see in many different ways that this thing was built by them. Even if they individually didn't participate, even if they don't know anybody who's on the team, when they send a support request, when they read like the FAQ and the way it's written, when they read the terms of service, which are actually human readable, and talk specifically and have their own FAQ that specifically addresses things like, what do we do when we get a DMCA takedown notice? And the answer is not, the YouTube thing where we're like, we're going to pull it down automatically with a system that doesn't, that doesn't see it, actually look at it. And that there's actually somebody individually looking at each instance. And again, this creates trust, and that encourages investment and lowering barriers in a way that is not the case where you feel like you're just being sold something, or where you feel like you're being given something by someone who is sort of like, and here, lower person down there, I'm going to hand you this thing. It's a gift out of the goodness of my heart, and pay me money for it. It does create a different feeling. And so really what I kind of want to, so what I would like to make a case for, I think, more broadly, is just a sense of trying to have that mindset when creating things, of trying to sort of be in the trenches with your audience and trying to be part of it with them. Try to have the experience even as you're giving the experience. And I think that sort of establishing that kind of trust with the reader, with the audience for whatever it is you're producing. And I think that creates a different kind of work. I think it creates a warmer kind of work, a more generous kind of work. And I would like to see more of it. So thank you very much. And I was afraid that I was not going to have enough material, and it turns out I've talked quite a lot. But I'm happy to take a couple of questions if anyone has them.
All right. Have you ever used critters.org, and how do you feel like that maybe compares or contrasts with the existing kind of fanfic trading stuff you were talking about?
So critters.org, I have used it. It's basically a site where you sign up to do to critique other people's original work, and they give you critiques of your work in return. You sort of earn points, if I'm remembering correctly. And in fact, the problem with Critters and the problem with most writing workshops is precisely that it is quid pro quo. And the problem is that you're coming into it as a writer, and while other writers can be very good critiquers, in fact, most of my best beta readers are themselves people who write as well. At the same time, when you're doing it in order to get feedback on your own piece, that is a completely different motivation than what happens in fanfic, where the motivation is, I want that story you've written to be as good as it can possibly be for me. Where you're coming in from a mindset of, I really love this, I love what you do, and I want to make it better. With any kind of writing workshop, I mean, sometimes you can get lucky, and I think that's when you get really great work out of writing workshops, is where you have a small group of people in a sort of intimately who really like each other's work, and who really want to kind of all rise together, who are kind of doing not necessarily the same thing, but adjacent enough things and like what each other are doing well enough. Because otherwise, it's very hard. You know, one of the hardest things about taking feedback, one of the hardest things to learn, I think, and I don't feel like I learned this until I had been writing for maybe 15 years, was how not to take feedback, the feedback to leave on the table. And a lot of times, the problem is, you know, when you get like critiques from critters.org, frequently you'll get like 5 or 6 critiques that are all kind of pulling the story in opposite directions because they all want something different from the story. And so as a result, I do think that you get better editing when you're being edited by people who want to read the story as opposed to by people who want critique on their own work. Yes?
As a practical matter, how much of an impediment is copyright law to the production of fan fiction?
So copyright law has the fair use exemption here in this country, and that could be an entire separate talk on its own, but it makes exemptions for transformative, not exemptions specifically, but there's a fair use test basically, and some of the characteristics that it looks at are whether a work is transformative, and whether a work is non-commercial, whether it's competing in the market. Obviously, the kind of fan fiction that I'm talking about is non-commercial. It is being posted for free. It's not competing with the original work. And in fact, you know, generally, you don't really see fan fiction for something unless it's also just like a hit, because you need a big enough base of audience for people who want to write in that fandom to find each other, in a way. And so copyright law, basically, for a long time, a lot of misunderstandings about copyright law and how it affects fan fiction. And a lot of fan fiction writers were sort of underground as a result, or would say there was like a default knee-jerk thing of people saying, oh, fan fiction's illegal. No, it's not. And obviously, any one individual piece, the fair use defense is an affirmative defense, meaning you don't get to know whether like your fan fiction story is fair use unless you actually get sued and go to court. And first of all, nobody's going to sue a fan fiction writer because why would you? That's like, and you're my biggest fan, I'm going to sue you for putting out that free advertising for my work. How dare you? And the fan fiction writer's like, I have no money. So there's really nothing to sue them for. And it also, and also, I mean, nobody's really going to sue because nobody wants to lose that case. And we're one of the things the OTW does is a lot of legal advocacy. And basically, we feel they would lose. So that's what I can tell you. So yes.
What do you think of authors who maintain more direct relationships with their communities, especially Brendan Sanderson?
Who maintain their own kind of interactive community with their readers, you mean? Yeah, I mean, obviously that's one of the things that's going on, with social media, kind of lowering the barriers, lowering the distance, and making communication more just easier. Simply, a lot of authors are doing that, but I think it's related, but it's not exactly the same. The work of connecting on a sort of individual basis to people is also does form communities, and it also has some of that same work. And I do think of Brandon Sanderson as a writer who is also trying deeply to entertain his audience. I do think of him as one of the writers who wants you to have a really great time when you're reading his stuff.
Yeah, also Warbreaker, where he published all the drafts and let people review them on their own.
Right, and exactly, he is trying to invite people to come in and play in that same way. So yes, it's absolutely, but there are two kind of separate things. Like what I actually kind of want to talk about is more like the literary aesthetic, like the mindset of the actual work that you produce when you're having that kind of motivation, which is separate from a lot of writers. A lot of creators don't actually have the ability don't have the ability or the energy. I mean, Brandon has crazy amounts of energy. I was on a panel recently where we formed the theory that every time he finishes a book, he gets to clone himself, and that's how he continues to produce at this level. But a lot of people just don't have the cycles, basically, the time to produce, to interact on that level. On a personal level, and so what I'm kind of interested in is how you can nevertheless put yourself in a mindset where you're, as the writer, where you're trying to experience, where you're trying to make work from that position, even if you're not actually spending a lot of time talking to your direct audience one-on-one.
Also, what about fanfics with their own sub-fandoms, especially Methods of Rationality, which has a number of recursive spin-off fics?
What do you mean, people who are writing fan fiction of book universes?
Well, of other fan fictions, especially Methods of Rationality has at least 5 or 6.
Oh, sure. No, that's all. I mean, that's been happening for a long time. People write sequels to each other's fanfic constantly in fandom. And in fact, one of the things that the archive policies specifically allow is that, there's actually code in there for listing another story as the inspiration or as the basis that you either remixed it or you wrote a sequel or something. Yeah.
Hi, just wondering your thoughts on other sites and platforms like fanfiction.net and what you've learned from those other sites and platforms when building out AO3.
So fanfiction.net, and are we out of time? Is it okay if we keep going? Last question, okay. So fanfiction.net has been around for years and years, and I feel I have a complicated set of feelings about it. First of all, it came out of the community. It was built long before anybody had the idea that it was going to make money. The people who built it for basically their friends, and so I think of it as a labor as part of this community. In a way that I didn't think of, for instance, the company FanLib that I talked about briefly that came in and was going to do it from outside. They basically just looked at the Google ad revenue of fanfiction.net and were like, oh, we want a piece of that, even though they had literally no connection to the community. The problems with fanfiction.net is now they are advertiser supported, they are for profit, and that has problems that we've seen, in general with social media networks. I mean, we all know this, right? If you're not paying for it, you're part of the product. And so, the way that results is, for instance, you've got advertisers. The advertiser's like, oh, we don't want that Harry Draco NC-17 slash on the archive. On the fanfiction.net site. And so periodically fanfiction.net would go and purge enormous swaths of stories and kick people off with no warning, no chance to save their work. Similar things happened on LiveJournal, which was enormously popular around the time that we were founding the archive. And that, of course, is terrible from the perspective of somebody who wants to preserve the entire community and really see the kind of work that is being done. And, so that's why the archive is we're really aggressively protect the free speech rights. We don't take any advertising. It's like, public radio, basically. We have a fundraising drive twice a year, and we ask people to support it, and people have supported it more than enough to continue it, keeping it afloat. But that's sort of the problem with fanfiction.net. I think and for a long time, and now Wattpad, similarly, anything that ultimately has a for-profit motive is not reliable when what you're producing, when you don't have where you don't have the power of an actual contract, where you don't have the power that your thing is not making you money. Your fan fiction is not making you money, and so you can't actually afford to spend money on it, in a way. You can't kind of afford to have a legal battle. So that's my general feeling. That's why we made the archive a nonprofit. The OTW is a nonprofit. All right, thank you so very much.